Anyway, you're very welcome, and we are all very curious about if this thing about gamification is a hype or not.
Thank you. I think one of the first things I did when I was a PhD student was attend a workshop and have a presentation which Jens attended, and he didn't agree on my views on the Golden Bow, I think, what it was about. We'll see about, I'll get to another book which we both read and we'll discuss that later also, I guess. So thank you for inviting me here. I'll be talking about gamification, which is a hot topic in many research fields and consultants and so on. I will be giving more of a background of it and some reflections of my own, which are actually critical. I won't be talking about any projects or something I've done there, so I don't have an invested interest in that way. But really, I want to have a discussion going. So if you have any questions or anything which is unclear, something interrupting, we will have a discussion about it. Since I'm here, I guess I don't need to really explain who I am. This is, however, official PR material from the Interactive Institute, where I work 25%. So this is how I'm presented at my other work, which might be good for everybody to know. And they told me to dress like this and so on. Otherwise, yes, I'm a senior researcher. I'm associate professor here at the Interaction Design. And I do play a lot of games, so I work and play with the same things. So the research I've done, the thing which has had most impact, I guess, in research is the work I've done on gameplay design patterns, which is basically a way of talking about gameplay, talking about the choices you have if you're designing a game, if you have a certain mechanic or something, what consequences, how do they relate to each other. It's a way of having a design language. You can also, of course, use it to analyze existing games. But otherwise, I've actually been working quite a lot with making different types of games also, which explains why I'm in the interaction design field and not just studying games. So, a couple of very simple facts about games. If you think about a game, a typical game people will think about is chess or something. That's our prototype or template for a game in many cases. And it's quite given that games, they do have rules. You can't move the pieces whenever you want to or however you want to. There are goals. You're supposed to checkmate the opponent's king before it happens to your own. And there are different types of actions you do. And I'm just mentioning this because I'll come back to it later, but it's a rather simple way of understanding games. Now I have to say something since we're talking in English. If you talk about games in English, it can include things which don't translate to the Swedish word spel. It instead translates into lek in Swedish. Children's play or free play and so on. I'm talking about not that. I'm talking about spel, which is kind of irritating when you're talking to international researchers because they don't understand the difference all the time and don't want to make the distinction. So, yes, very simple idea what a game is. But maybe more interesting, what happens when you play a game? Well, people tend to like games. They tend to be absorbed in them. They tend to lose track of time and so on, and think they're really interesting to do. And there's a model for explaining this, which actually comes from psychology. Csikszentmihalyi, who's a psychologist, he thought that you should maybe study what makes people happy instead of studying what stops them being unhappy, being a bit more proactive. So he actually interviewed a lot of people who considered themselves happy most of the time. And they came from all different types of life. They had different jobs, different ages and so on. But he asked them to explain to him, when are they the most happy? And he found a couple of things which were similar in everything they said. They were doing an activity which required skill, so they could feel that they were good at something. But it wasn't too easy. They didn't feel that they were at one point doing something and then thinking, but they were doing both at the same time. So they did something and they got feedback and could reflect on it and so on. And to do this, they of course needed the feedback, but also clear goals, what they were trying to do, so they could see if they succeeded or not. They had to be able to concentrate on the task, also to be able to do it and so on. They also experienced a weird paradox, that they felt that they were doing something, and doing it well. But it wasn't actually they doing that. They could sense themselves or observe themselves doing it while they were doing it. So they weren't really sure, am I doing it, or is it my body doing it, or something. And they could lose themselves in it. And it might be that you were doing this activity for an hour, but it felt like 5 minutes, or the other way around. And it became its own purpose. Why do they do these things? They did it because they liked it. And this was actually describing people working, or having a good time doing some sport, or some craft, or some hobby, or something like this. But it also fits very well with how people feel while playing games. So it's been adopted quite a lot by people who do research on games. And just to explain this diagram, it's an activity that requires skill. That means, actually, if you do something for some time and you like it, you're likely to get better at it. So if you have this flow experience, you might be here maybe, but if you get better at it, it will not be challenging after time. You'll actually move in this direction, your skill will go up, and you will be bored. The way to compensate this is to try and do something more difficult. If it is too difficult to begin with, then you're frustrated instead. The tricky thing with different activities is to try and be in this flow channel. So as you get better, the activity must get more difficult. And this isn't always easy in job situations, balancing this. In games, it's rather easy to design it this way. You have a level. If you complete it, you get to the next level, which is more difficult, but you had to become better to do it. So you're typically moving between being frustrated and bored, but hopefully the flow channel. Yes?
I just think that it's maybe a bit of a simplification to say that people play games all the time because they like it so much. I mean, it could be for other reasons. I mean, it's very addictive in many cases to play games. I mean, it can ruin people's lives completely.
But I would say, then they like it.
Okay. Just like the alcoholic likes the bottle.
Yes.
Yeah.
It isn't good for them, but they might like it.
Okay.
Then again, the other part is that if you look at people playing games most of the time, they mainly look frustrated and very focused. So they don't look happy. Because they're doing these things and they're absorbed in it and forget themselves and so on. So actually they don't look happy. It's afterwards they say they were happy when doing it. So yes, you can complicate it even more. Yeah.
I can understand sort of the flow. You talked about more difficult levels in a game. But the previous game you showed, chess.
Yeah.
How do you fit that in the model?
Good question. Yes. If you start playing chess, it's a bit complicated in the beginning to learn the moves and so on. So you have to start down here. You're not very skilled, but then it's playing it that way. The way to compensate that you're getting better in chess is finding a more difficult opponent. Mm-hmm. In many cases, when you play chess, actually your opponent will not play at his or her best, or not use all pieces or something like that to balance it. So actually, games where you compete against somebody else is rather easy to do this, especially if you have handicap systems or you have leagues where you can have skill levels where you can measure against each other. That's why you kind of golf works and tournaments work. But it's a good question.
I have also a question.
Yeah.
What happens with memory when you are in flow? Do you remember things like 3 times better, or do you remember things worse?
Well, you're doing these things when you're playing or when you're in the flow experience.
If you're in a flow experience for 1 hour, would that make you better recall what you have learned during this hour?
I haven't read any studies of that regarding to flow, so I can't answer that. But it kind of seems reasonable to argue that, well, if you played something or did some other activity and it felt like 5 minutes but it was 1 hour, you don't remember it very well, do you? I would guess that, but I haven't read any studies of it, right? But then again, it might not be that much to remember, actually, because you're doing the same kind of thing quite a lot, so, and it works well, so you don't need to, but yeah.
No, but memory is enhanced by pleasure, usually. So if you really enjoy it, then...
And in one way, people who have a flow experience can probably talk quite a lot about it and are happy to talk about it, so they definitely remember it in some way. But if they remember the small details, I'm not sure. But then again,
Is this really true? Isn't memory just as enhanced by pain?
Pain and pleasure.
Yeah,
and repetition.
So.
Most, that's not,
but I mean, if it's a neutral day, an ordinary day in November last year, for example, what did you do then? What did you have for breakfast?
Yeah.
It was so ordinary that you don't care.
Right.
I mean, you don't remember it.
I think it's what counts is if it's out of the ordinary.
Yeah, that's also a factor.
It's not really pain or pleasure. It's
but it's we
Yeah,
talked
pain
about
and
that
pleasure
before.
are
It's
examples.
like curiosity, the pleasure of discovering something new, the pleasure of discovering something.
This is good. I won't get through my 27 slides. Great. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. It might enhance your proneness to acquire a skill, or you might more easily acquire a skill, and that's some kind of memory at different levels, procedural or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily connected to the episodic memory in the same way. So you might be right. I mean, I don't know. I have no idea, but you might forget what happens in episodic terms, although you enhance your capacity in some other way.
Yeah. I don't have a slide on it actually, since it's a game designer who's been thinking about why we play games, and he makes the argument, a bit based on this, that we play games primarily because we learn by playing games, and our brain rewards us by feeling fun when we play, or when we learn something. So games are distilled things for learning. What we learn is a completely different question. We can learn something completely pointless, but our brain thinks it's fun to learn something. So I tell my students that, and then I tell them, so if you're not having fun during a lecture, you're not learning anything, which they think is fun, so I hope they learn something. We can go back to this, but the thing is...
But what if your students are frustrated and think the teacher is stupid, and then afterwards they remember why they thought he was stupid? Haven't they learned a lot then?
Yeah, that's why I try to be obnoxious sometimes also. So so it can work that way also, of course.
It's very easy for me.
So, but this is kind of, wouldn't it be great if we could feel this all the time while we were working or something like that? Something which we don't feel that now. Can we change the situation so it is this way?
What does paradox of control mean?
Well, the point there is that you're obviously control. If you take maybe skydiving, you could have a flow experience doing that, or sailing. You're in control in the way that you're clearly steering the sailing boat. We'll go with that example. But maybe it's like more, you can observe yourself also sailing. So you have this double perception of what's happening. You're clearly doing something, but it's not you doing it. It's kind of, your consciousness doesn't need to be in the loop. It can just take the back seat and observe it.
It's like in Star Wars, trust the Force.
Kind of. I can say I've had this experience twice or 3 times in my life, very clearly. One while playing 3-dimensional Tetris on the highest level, and the phone called, and I answered and started to talk about it. So then I was talking, playing a game, and I was observing myself playing, but I didn't understand how my fingers could do what it was doing. So it was definitely a paradox of control, because it was me, but it wasn't me doing it. And that might be just because you've done it so much that you're good at it. But that's my read. But, it might be slightly different. So anyway, wouldn't it be great if you could have this in other activities? People actually do have it in other activities, but can we design for that? One idea for doing this is basically, since this often occurs in games, let's make games out of things people should do or learn. This is nowadays called serious games. Everybody agrees that's a bad name for it, because it irritates people who play ordinary games. It's like, why aren't our games serious? I'm very serious when I'm playing this game, and so on. So it's a bad name, but it's the one which is stuck. Here's one example where you as Marines or soldiers can train on how to interact with people in other countries through a game. And then you could argue how much is it a game or not, is it just a game engine for doing training? You can do it for doing exercises on rescuing people in disasters. Paramedics can train on the proper procedure to take care of people. You might have it to try and influence the opinions of people about different things going on in the world, making them aware of it, making them think about it. You can do it to train people to take care of customers at the hotel also. So it's kind of job training, but as a game. Hopefully making it better also. These things don't always work. Sometimes they do work, sometimes they don't work. If you have the feeling like, is this good or not? Well, then you're probably agreeing with most other people that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. There's actually quite a long story of these things, so I'll be going through examples of how people have been doing this earlier. I said Serious Games is the name we have now. Before it was called Edutainment, but that failed so badly they had to invent a new name for it to be able to continue with it. And the reason why they failed with it, I can't give one easy answer for it. Probably it's because the people who did it didn't know enough about gameplay design, that they were actually quite bad games. Since I do research in gameplay design, I kind of have to say that, right? But in many cases, if you have somebody who hasn't looked at how to design games, if they're going to have a message in their games, who want to learn something, they typically put that in the theme of the game, not in the system. Because it's more difficult to design a system and to understand how it works. You can be pretty clear about the concept or the theme of the game. The problem is that people who play games, they might use the theme to understand how it works, but the more they understand the game, the less they think about the theme of the game. There's quite a lot of games you can play without understanding the language it's told in. And I think that's a good test. If you can complete the game or win the game without understanding the language it's presented in, then you probably won't be able to learn a lot of the content, right? So I think this is one problem they have with edutainment. They tried this primarily in schools because kids played a lot of games and let's use games in schools.
What are you supposed to do with that genetics game?
I think you're supposed to match them, so you learn that A and T go together and C and G go together. That's about it. Yeah.
Very simple.
And I have no idea how this is an educational game because it meets the potato head. But, this is what you find if you look at it for edutainment on the internet nowadays. But there are other examples. You could say, okay, serious games. Can we find examples of games where you're doing something else? This idea is very old, actually. You could argue the Olympic Games in ancient Greece, these were games which were also religious rituals. They didn't have wars during the Olympic Games because the athletes participating were sacred and had safe passage between the cities and couldn't compete. And this was a way to show who the gods favored. So it was a very serious part of this. Then, which I guess Jens can have, a very interesting book, one of the few which tried to explain how mankind became conscious or self-conscious. The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, quite a mouthful. This book has the idea that mankind became self-conscious in the 7th century BC, right?
Yep.
The problem was people didn't like becoming self-conscious because, according to this book, what happened before was that one half of our brain did most practical stuff. It was kind of the one talking, thinking, and feeling that I'm I. The other half kind of observed and every once in a while gave good advice. It was a voice in your head telling you what to do. And this could be interpreted as a god, or as spirits, or as your leader of the clan, or something like that. When we became conscious, this broke down. We didn't have this. And most people thought that was a problem. It's so easy to live life if somebody tells you what to do. You can be happy and trusting in that voice. So people try to invent ways to get back that voice. And alcohol and addictions is one part of doing that. But you can also roll dice or flip coins and see what the gods want you to do. So that's that's kind of the earliest evidence somehow we have of games in that period or something. So it was a way to talk to the gods or to know what to do, which is another way of saying that games were used for serious purpose.
I have a question.
Yes.
What does bicameral mean?
It's two chambers.
Oh, okay.
Vänster och höger hjärnhalva.
Kammare alltså.
So, yes, because they were more separated before and then it broke down.
He says they were more separated.
Yes, his main sources of evidence, so this is lecturing what not to do if you're doing research. Don't try to make theories about how the brain works, where your primary evidence comes from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Because he interprets those and so on. So, yeah. There are people who are trying to prove this in nowadays. But
there are people here in Sweden.
Yeah.
Robert Eklund believes in this theory.
I don't know if people are making good evidence or progress. It's kind of difficult to prove how people thought 2,000 years ago or something. You know, so it's a lot of speculations.
One of the main ideas is that people stopped talking to the gods after about that time. So before that they always, Pallas Athena and so on, where they were always interfering in human business, but after that period they didn't. It also happens to coincide with the time when the Greeks reinvented writing.
Yeah.
They had lost linear B and then they reinvented on the basis of Phoenician the alphabetic system. So, and then there's been a long discussion of this book and pros and cons. It's an interesting book.
Yeah, but it's kind of...
Why would you lose that idea because you are able to write or read?
I don't know. I just said that, but that period 700 BC that's the period when they
and that's when we started getting a lot of new religions.
It's also when they wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff going on at that period, but why is about a bit more recent examples, how people have used games for some serious purposes. There's a monk or a priest, Aldrich, in the 12th century. He codified a way of teaching virtues by you roll dice, and depending on which dice you had, you were supposed to make combinations of different virtues and collect them. To me it seems like they were playing dice about money, and they were told not to do it, so he kind of codified it as something else. But the rules are there. There's also some people who claim that there's evidence that the ancient Egyptians did bowling, but there's also arguments that in the monasteries, as a teaching tool, they used bowling, and you were supposed to try and hit as many of the pegs as possible, because these were heathens, so you were killing heathens, and the more you killed, the more you were Christian by doing it. Which is actually kind of a serious game in that way also, because you're playing a game in a tournament. And that might seem as a PR thing, or kind of making it more fun to go there to do these things. And if you feel that this is kind of manipulating it a bit, we'll get back to that in the talk later. So people have been using games in this way. More seriously, in the 19th century, the Germans started, based on that people were playing chess a lot, thinking about chess and how does chess relate to wars? It seemed to be the theme, but can you learn something about wars actually from chess? The Germans created war games, Kriegsspiel, and this is the original game which they used to train officers. And this was part of the kind of revolution in Prussia where they became much better at warfare. So there were a lot of other reasons, but they started training the officers on how to think about different issues using these parts. And if any of you play German board games, it's kind of interesting to look at the pieces that we're using, because that's basically what they use in many of the modern games nowadays. It's the same kind of thinking. So if you play a game like Carcassonne, well, it's kind of, it's the same tiles being used, and it's the small wooden blocks which kind of signify it's a German board game. That's being used. So this took off in Germany and then spread quite a lot, and has been used ever since, really, in the military. Kind of interesting, in the Soviet Union in the 30s, they realized they had a problem because they had killed off a lot of the intellectuals there, and they had to still run factories and stuff. So one thing they turned to was actually these war games, and seeing if they could be applied for peaceful solutions. How to organize factories, for example. So Bierstein is a Russian game researcher, game designer or something in the 30s, which developed this Red Weaver game to figure out how to best organize a factory in St. Petersburg. Then they had to stop this because Stalin banned research on, I think it was genetics, was it cybernetics and games, because these were problematic. Probably because you can't determine what is the correct answer in the beginning in the game. You have to adopt, so you can't say that this is the politically correct solution. Yeah. Game theory is a big thing which has been used for very serious things. And game theory, when people mention that, most people mention it in the sense of economics. That's where it's most famous. Because John von Neumann, who also invented the computer and did other things like atom bombs and so on, whose name I think is still misspelled in the building here. He and a colleague, Morgenstern, wrote a book called Game Theory in 1944, where they discussed that and talked a bit about how it could be applied to economics. It became very popular as an idea in economics. A lot of people who got Skandinaviska Enskilda Bankens Memorial Prize in honor of Nobel, the fake Nobel Prize, have been doing these things. Nowadays it's not that popular because it doesn't work if people aren't rational, which they aren't. However, it works much better in biology because animals are actually rational. They just do what they do. They don't do weird things. And it's also been used quite a lot in international diplomacy. So in the Cold War, the Americans had the strategy called MAD. John von Neumann invented that one, and he likes those kind of abbreviations. Mutually assured destruction. The idea is basically you have to have enough nukes and be able to detect the enemy launching nukes at you quickly enough to be able to launch back. So you can say, well, if you start a war, we'll kill each other and everybody will die. So it's no point for you to start. And it was von Neumann applying these things. So game theory has been involved in development of economical theory, which has been used quite a lot, and also in the Cold War and so on. The reason why I have 1928 here is that many people say, well, game theory isn't about games. It's only about economics. The problem is if you read the book, they say very specifically it is for games, otherwise they couldn't look at some details and so on, but then it can be applied to economics. And von Neumann in 1928 actually published a paper where he was explaining how to figure out the best way to play games. using the min-max method. And that has nothing to do with economics. There's no mention of it in that one. Why do I have pictures of 3 lizards here? This is an example of this paper, rock, scissors strategy. Do you know that? Do you know the game, paper, rock, scissors? So the interesting part of that game is that there isn't one guaranteed way of winning. So regardless of what you choose, somebody else can choose something better. So the whole game becomes about guessing what the other person is guessing that you're guessing, and it goes on forever and ever. But that there's no stable strategy, or there isn't one way of winning the game, can actually be found in biology in some cases. So these are 3 types of lizards belonging to the same species. These are all the males. I'm not going to read exactly which one is which one, so I'll probably mix up the colors, but I think this one is very, very aggressive and tries to mate with all females, which seems like a good strategy, right, to get a lot of kids and have the same kind of males in the next generation. The problem is this lizard looks a bit like the females, so he can infiltrate and get the offspring, which this one doesn't realize. So this one can take over with this one. This one picks a female and guards her very well. So that strategy doesn't work. Then again, this one doesn't have a chance against that one. So actually they take turns being a majority and so, which this game theory explains. So quite a lot of biology can work through this.
But you said before that game theory has grown out of fashion in economics.
Yeah.
But I think that they're still doing that a lot, and they have more sophisticated notions of rationality, for example.
So for example, I would say it's something everybody who studies economics have to start with this, and then you make it more complicated. And for example, John Nash, which is quite well known from the Beautiful Mind movie and so on, the prize he got was, together with others, was because they expanded this theory so it worked for people who didn't have perfect information and didn't make rational decisions. The problem is that people are even more unrational than that, so it doesn't work there. But it's, I think.
No, but you have the satisficing notion, for example, which is to try to obtain good enough. Like Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for that.
Yeah. So it's not irrelevant, but it's other things coming in also. So you can't just apply it. You have to use a lot more psychology and so on nowadays. So yes, some stuff where people have been using games in a serious fashion. But then again, I did show you these examples and these examples, and they kind of seem a bit puny with using compared to using it in the Cold War and so on. And they haven't been all that successful in all cases, and that has led people to think about, okay, is it always good to have it as a game? Some people don't want to play games because they think I'm doing something serious, and I consider games something to do when you have spare time. So you shouldn't mix these things. So then gamification is the idea that, okay, not everything should necessarily be a game, but maybe we can take ideas from how games can be designed and apply them in other situations. So one definition of this is the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. So you're actually not trying to make a game. You're trying to use the thinking behind what makes games work in different ways to influence the design of other things. James Paul G, who's a professor in education, basically did one version of this by looking at what good games do regarding learning, how good games teach the people who play it things, and compared it to classrooms. How classrooms are really bad at it most of the time. isn't saying anything about what you learn. He's not talking about the content, he's talking about the form. So, for example, games are pretty good at giving you feedback. It's pretty good at presenting information to you when you need it. Letting you test something until you master it and then move on and so on. And it's quite patient, and you become critically aware of what you're good at and not good at, and you can set up your own goals and so on. He has a list of these, I think it's 36 or 37 learning objectives games can have, which classrooms don't have that often. Jane McGonigal is, I guess, the poster girl for gamification most of the time. She has TED Talks and so on about it, so it's very easy to find more information about gamification by Googling her name. What should be pointed out is she never uses the word gamification when she talks. She started talking about this before it was popular, and she has a slightly different take. I would say that many times she's talking more about how to make lekar, children's play or free play, and games. So this is the idea with gamification, and it's become quite popular in the industry now. There's consultancies selling this idea and so on. People are critical to it. The main criticism is that they're just trying to easily add something to an activity. That's what, I don't have a slide for that, that's why I'm telling you here now. Because basically in many cases, consultancy firms which have a quick fix for this is basically putting a point system on an activity you're doing, having a high score list and giving badges if you're the employee of the month or something like that. How many papers did each person publish this year? And you get 1 point, and the one who gets the most point gets a golden star. And then everybody would be happy and try to publish more. Did anybody think that sounded like a good idea? It's because then they're trying to add something on top of it. You have to go a bit deeper into it. My point on gamification is that they're actually thinking too small.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
You said before that game in English maybe corresponds to spel och lek in Swedish.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the word game in English is even richer. And so there's a book by Eric Byrne, Games That People Play. You know that book?
No, I haven't read that one.
Which is more or less about patterns of interaction and behavior, which has some kind of psychological explanation, which isn't always, they're not thinking the optimal way, maybe.
Yeah.
So if that's covered by the word game in English, I don't think spel och lek actually fits.
No, you need another one also.
Another word as well, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how much this psychological take on games might have come into this.
Yeah.
If you said this girl,
Jane McGonigal.
yeah, was actually doing what we call lek in Swedish.
Yeah.
Is anyone doing more the psychological?
I would say there's one part, I think you pointed out a good thing, and there's probably many more parts you could add to that. The one I would add immediately is role playing.
Role play, yeah.
Yeah, because that's what I thought about when you were saying games people play, because if I'm kind of teasing you or something, it might be a lek, but it might also be that we're playing a role that I'm somebody and you're somebody else. That is kind of weird. And then you have other ways of
I think he uses the term role, but it's more like the little brother role, the father role, the mother role, that sort of thing.
So there are many aspects, and that's kind of, I would say the people doing game research, there are two camps. One who just says, let's call everything game and talk about whatever we want to, and some people are saying like, can we maybe talk about different types and give names to them? But that doesn't get traction because then others feel that you're trying to make this into the only thing which is okay to do research. But you're right, yes, you can find more. I think the people talking about gamification are actually thinking too small in one way. Jane McGonigal wants to kind of gamify everything. She says that reality is broken and it can be fixed by games, which is a kind of big claim. I think it's kind of too small. My point is that, well, when you look at games and research games and so on, you can actually do it from several different perspectives. You can look at the games themselves. That's kind of easy because it's the thing you can see in front of you, right? You can look at the people playing games, why they play games and so on. That's kind of, if you're thinking about the flow model, that's looking at what the players are doing, right? What the gamers are doing. And then gaming, I'm not saying playing now, I'm saying gaming to make the distinction between the two. Looking at the activity, which I kind of think is the most interesting one. But the point is, if you're looking at a game, you can look at it without the gamers, without it being played, analyzing it alone. You can look at gamers, what do they do when they're not playing games, and so on. What type of people play games and so on. That doesn't really have to do anything with the games. And it can still be interesting. And then if you think about gaming in the same way, do people game other things than games? So most people get stuck in that you need this because it's easy to think about, right? So I think, can you find examples where this doesn't exist? So gaming activities. And I'll present some examples here. The first one, gaming educations. This is an easy one to sell to students. I typically explain to them and they kind of reluctantly agree to it. There are some books and studies on this. The hidden curriculum was written by somebody who worked at MIT who was describing how students and the faculty at MIT had to play a game to be able to pass courses in advance and so on. And he actually had some students describing how they had to do this in game theory terms because they'd taken courses in this. So they kind of saw it as a game, and there were unstated rules on how you should behave or what to study and so on, and it was figuring out this game and doing that which was the most important, not necessarily learning. Miller and Parlett did this rather small study on people taking exams, and they found that there were 3 categories of students. The ones who were cue seekers, that's the typical student who goes up and says, yes, I have to help my parents repair their car because they broke down and so on, so I won't have time to read everything. Could you say something which is more important to read on than others? So they're trying to get hints on what to read on. So they don't need to read everything. They can maximize their efficiency. Then there are the people who are cue aware. They know that you need to do this as well. But they don't ask, they just listen to the ones asking the questions. So they kind of tag along. Then there are the cue deaf. They're not aware that this game is being played. They might, and typically are the ones who are most interested in learning. Normally they are quite likely to have bad grades because they don't try to pick up these small parts. My example of this is when I took a course in my 5th year at the university at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and I was sitting at the back at the lecture hall together with a friend's girlfriend who was she was in her 2nd year. And I was making small doodles or trying to convince people to play games. So I wasn't listening really to the lecture. Except every once in a while I sat up and wrote down exactly what the teacher said. And then I started making doodles again. And my friend's girlfriend went like, Staffan, you can't do this after the lecture. How you won't pass the exam? And then I realized what was like, no, but I can hear on the pitch of the voice, the teacher, when it's important. And then I write that down, because that will be in the exam. And I passed that exam, but I learned how to take courses there. You listen to the tone of the voice of the teacher, that's what's important. So I was good at playing that game. I don't know if I was good at learning the course. So I was gaming this thing. And most students can recognize themselves in doing this. Most of us have kind of like, okay, how many proofs if it's a math exam do I need, and how many of these things and so on. Which, is this good or bad that people are doing this?
Bad.
Bad? Yeah, I would tell you.
Human behavior.
Human behavior, yeah. So it's kind of...
It won't always work.
No.
So, I mean, it's chance thing to do this. I mean,
Yeah, and it's, but quite a lot of people do it also.
Oh, sure.
Because it's the easiest.
and then they get angry when they fail, and then it's the teacher's fault for not playing the game.
So you could think about, can you redesign the course so it's more difficult to do this, for example. Yeah, it's something to discuss, I guess, at a meeting about the education, right, about courses and so on. Another example, warfare. I already talked about the mutually assured destruction part, but there's a book called Trench Warfare, The Live and Let Live System, which is a sociologist who has gone through letters and done interviews with people in the First World War. And noted that, okay, there were the elite battalions who were really trying to kill each other and so on, but the people who were just conscripted into doing the battle, they mostly wanted to survive. And they noticed that if you don't try to kill the other side, they don't try to kill you as much. So your best chance of surviving is trying to not kill the enemy. That's why there are some figures saying like 90% of the bullets fired in the First World War weren't aimed at anybody. Because you couldn't just not shoot, because then you would get shot. But you could shoot, but try to miss. And so on. And this developed in very weird ways. It's kind of, most people have heard that in the first Christmas during the war, the soldiers played football with each other and so on. Because they kind of knew each other a bit. A lot of Germans had actually been and worked in the UK, so they kind of said like, "Hi, I'm Fritz. I work in London, and what's the score in the football league or something like that?" So they talked to each other a bit. But then they also did things like they had to go on raids, so they had to look. But then you can say, well, it's bad weather, so I don't know. But when you had to go on raid, you could just not go all the way. You go crawl out in the middle area for a bit. You might meet the enemy, but not do anything, because they also had to do it. The officers realized this was a problem, and they tried to fix it in different ways. Ordering raids, for example, was one. Giving hand grenades to people, because it's easy to kill people with hand grenades, but you can always throw it and miss. So there are examples when they were like 20 meters from each other in the trenches. So they could have hit each other, but they didn't. They could have shot at each other while people were being exchanged or serving food, but they didn't, because then their own food would be shot at. Every once in a while it broke down, but they fixed it. So they were trying to play a game where they were trying to kill as few as possible, but still follow the orders of their officers. I think one of the most extreme examples were when the artillery on, I think it was the German side, fired artillery pieces between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. So the Brits knew that and were in the bunkers, and then they went up. And sometimes they could pretend to be very brave for the officers because they went up 1 minute past 2, because the Germans were on time. And then the British fired back between 5 and 7 in the afternoon. So they had rituals with these things. Of course it broke down several times, so people killed each other, and it didn't work in some
Several
parts.
million times, I think.
But this was the way the ordinary soldiers were actually actively trying to do something to increase their likelihood of surviving. So they were actually gaming this. Is this good or bad that they did? Here's more a case where it's good, right, instead of bad. Except if you're an officer. But actually the soldiers also, one of the reasons why they were doing this was that the officers were way back, just getting telegraph lines and not knowing exactly what they did, and they were just playing with things in different boards, they thought. So, yeah.
It seems like you make a difference between gaming and competing or something like that.
I haven't really talked about competing that much, because here they're trying to use a system, kind of, but they're not competing against others, even if they have both the Germans and their officers to compete with in different ways. So not all games are about competition, that's right. But some games are. So there's a distinction there, I guess. Yes.
What would you say this kind of gaming, French warfare gaming, or the live and let die gaming.
Yeah, that's where the
Yeah.
Bond name comes from.
Yeah.
Was one of the movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What elements of the typical game does it contain? It seems that could be a combination of what von Neumann described. I mean, a rationality game, and some kind of making up your own rules or something like that. I mean,
Yeah, you could say that I said that games consist of rules, goals, and actions, right? And you can easily find the officers came with a lot of the rules, right? That you had to follow, otherwise you would get shot. But then they invented their own rules quite a lot also.
yeah, so they
Between the parties.
pretended following the
So they had to
rules.
follow it to a certain degree. They had to follow the not the intention, but the letter of it, right? In a non-obvious way. So they were playing against that system which the officers did. But they had their own goal.
I think it's fairly similar to the prisoner's dilemma. You can illustrate this with a little matrix like that.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the reason why I became aware of this was because I was reading a book about cooperation, which was using the prisoner's dilemma and game theory, and they were quoting this. So yeah, you can definitely find links between these things. And that, of course, also is an argument for why you can see this as gaming. That people can do that.
But that's more of this game theory part of it.
Yeah.
The von Neumann part.
Yeah, but I guess there's quite a lot of psychology in that. So it's one perspective you can apply on it, but Ashworth didn't do it from that perspective at all. He doesn't talk about game theory.
I mean, even if you said before that von Neumann meant to say something in 1928 about how you
have
make
the best chance of winning a board game.
the best chance of it. I mean, but you could easily think up situations where it's not a lot of game ingredients in the psychological description given by the name I cannot pronounce.
Checks out me out.
Yeah. Where it's just a way of rationally figuring out how to do something.
I think that rationally thinking out how to do something can give you a flow experience also.
Can give, but I mean, then everything collapses into game as soon as someone is satisfying some rationality constraints, and that wouldn't be. I think that wouldn't be good for game research. I mean, it collapses into discussion of rational.
Yeah, or
behavior.
intentionality or consciousness
Yeah.
or something. Yeah. We'll see what this presentation
Yeah,
is.
okay.
Another example. Gambling and stock trading. This was something which started by Edward Thorpe, this guy, and Claude Shannon, which you might know about here, right? Information theory. It's actually, yes, I need to point out, he invented this also. This is the ultimate machine. It has a switch. If you flip the switch, this opens and the machine turns itself off. Yes. That's what he did after inventing parts of the computer and information theory. The Kelly criterion is this formula. It tells you, depending on how much more information you have than others, how much money you should bet on something. This is proven, if you follow this and you know your things, this is the quickest way to make money, and you're guaranteed never to lose all your money. Thorpe realized that this is interesting. Yes, maybe we should try and use this in maybe casinos or something. So he and Shannon built the world's first wearable computer and went to Vegas and played and won some money. Then Thorpe thought, well, yes, let's work a bit more on it. And then he did some research and published a book on how to guarantee winning when you're playing blackjack, which meant that after a while the casinos change the rules, but there's a guaranteed way of winning there.
By counting, right? By counting cards.
Counting cards, yes. So you know, but you don't even have to do that much counting. Basically, I think the easiest way, which you can't do anymore because they changed the rules, but it's basically keeping track of the number of cards below 7 and above 7 or something, and you just +1 and -1.
You can do it, but they have several decks, and they are going to
but you can do it
observe you
also.
if you try to do it. I mean,
If you're interested in this, come to me later. I have 2 or 3 books about people who have been doing this very recently, actually, and counting cards, but you typically have to do quite a lot of role-playing, because you have to pretend to be a very rich, stupid, drunk guy also while doing this, and have a crew of people, one person counting and one playing. So the typical thing is one is playing, just counting, and then gives a signal to somebody else who comes and invests a lot because he appears to be a drunk person not doing what he's doing. But you need the math also, so yes. It's typically MIT students. There's movies about it also. Then, forethought, yes, this is nice, but can't we do it for something else? The stock market? And the problem is, you can't bet in 2 directions with stocks. You can buy them, you can sell them, but you can't bet that it's difficult to make yourself make money when the stock goes down. Just a stock.
you can do that.
Huh?
You can do that with with hedge funds and things
Yes,
like that.
because then you can buy insurances on stocks, which you don't even have to own.
Options.
Yeah.
So you can buy an insurance on something you don't have
7%,
and make money if the stock goes down. And because you can have both of these, you can use this formula to invest money, which he started at one of the first hedge funds. And I think he's had kind of an average increase in the value of 20% or something the last 30 years or something. There's a lot of other people doing that. A lot of people, they call quants or something because they're quantifying things and putting numbers on it, has been doing this. And this has led to at least one or a couple of the collapses on the stock market because too many people are doing it and they're competing against each other. But they're basically using these game-based things. So is this good or bad?
Bad.
Bad. Yes.
Beating the dealer in the casino, I mean, that's not.
Okay, so yes, against the casinos it's okay. In the stock market it's less good. Yes. It should be noted here that Shannon has had a better return of investment on his money he bought in stocks, but he just bought them and never sold anything. So there's another way of doing it also. But he did it because he invested in tech firms like in the 60s, and which were doing good things. So yes, you can game that also. So I've been going through the educational system, warfare, and the stock market. So what's left? Voting is another one. The first one to criticize this was actually the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, yeah.
George Dodgson.
Yeah, so his real name is Dodge. Because there are problems with vote systems. And actually the caucus race, which is part of the stories about Alice in Wonderland, is a critique of the voting system. Because depending on how you start to vote, anybody can win, so nobody wins or everybody wins. Most people don't get that by reading the story. I never got that. But there's also a lot of tactical voting. You can kind of, should you vote only on the person you like the most, and then the second best person, should you just put him at the bottom because you don't want him to win instead of others? There's a lot of these ways of doing it, which are suboptimal. And you can get really bad results of this because people are. In Sweden, I guess, in the 80s at least, the typical thing was that people from the, who usually voted on the Social Democratic Party, voted on the Communist Party or Vänstern, VPK. That's an easy Swedish example. I guess yesterday a lot of people went voting just to keep the Swedish Democrats out of the churches. which is maybe a good way of doing this. But you can game voting a lot also. And there are different systems which have different problems with this. There isn't one system which is good or fair. There is mathematical proof saying that you can't have a fair voting system. But you can have better than the ones we have. Yeah.
But in terms of the political voting, how do you, I mean, it's individuals, or it's not the collective effort to vote. I mean, we talk about, for instance, stödrösta for Kristdemokraterna or for any other party, but since it's only the individual's own choice to do this.
Well, the typical case when it goes bad, when you can say it doesn't work or becomes a problem, is that when people, they don't vote for what they really want to happen, in the way it can be expressed in the vote, because they're trying to change the system a bit. Like, yes, I don't really want VPK to rule Sweden, but I want them to have some power so they can help the Social Democrats rule, because I like them. But if everybody did that, so VPK became the biggest party, then it would be a big problem, right? So you're gambling that while you are doing something you really don't believe in, most of the other people will still play the right way, so it will work. But then you can have, I think they got into this situation in one of the states in the US where they had to choose between a politician who had been corrupt and been in jail a couple of years, or a neo-Nazi. Those were their options. And it's like, how did we get here? We had several candidates before, and how did we get to this point? Because people were playing against each other because they didn't want this and they didn't want that, and they didn't think that everybody else would do it. And then they got to that position, so then they had to kind of go around saying like, yes, vote for the corrupt bad guy because he's less worse than the neo-Nazi. So it can go bad in that case, because you're trusting everybody else to do the right thing and then you're trying to manipulate the system. If too many people are doing that, it goes bad. And some voting systems are more prone to having this happening than others. So that's, I think the best one is the one which you can have on some websites where you can rank different things. And you can rank everybody. You can kind of say like, yes, you're a 10, you're a 10, you're a 9, you're a 1, you're a 1. If you can choose everyone and rank everyone, that's the best way. Because most people are likely to be happy with the results. And you're not so inclined to have a reason to do anything.
But you can play with that as well by ranking them. I mean,
but it isn't as bad as others.
It's harder for most people to figure out how to.
Voting, yes. So the voting system, and then religion. I'm going through big topics here, right? Yes. Consanguinity. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
No. So do you want to explain it?
Kinship.
Yeah. So in medieval times in Europe, you couldn't get a divorce because God said you've been married and so on. But sometimes people wanted to get a divorce anyway. And the Catholic Church figured out a reason which you could apply sometimes. And that was that, yes, we're relatives. Adam and Eve, we're all relatives, and relatives got married. So the church sometimes said, yes, no, this marriage doesn't work because you're too closely related. And that kind of gave me putting one rule against the other and so on. And then the church has the power to decide if this is right or wrong. Indulgence is one of these other examples, where you can pay the church and then your sins are forgiven. So it's both ways for the kind of church to make money. Nikamuta, which is horrible pronunciation, I guess, is something which happens in the Islamic world, some parts of it. There, you're not allowed to have sex unless you're married. Otherwise, you're committing a sin. You can... First, I think it started off with that you could get a temporary marriage for 2 years or 3 years with somebody. and it was a business idea. But it's been refined, so now you can go to a hotel and you can get married by a mullah for 1 hour, and then get a divorce, and you're not having sex outside of the marriage. This is also somewhat like gaming a system, right? This is not what you're supposed to do, but it's following all the rules. The Jews are kind of good at this also. They kind of like it, actually. There's kosher food, which you're not allowed to eat. And it's really problematic sometimes to figure out if you're doing the right thing or not. So there are some examples where their rabbi have looked at, okay, let's say we have 10 pieces of candy, and we think one is bad. You shouldn't eat it if you're trying to be kosher. Well, you can eat the first, right, because it's so little risk that you're wrong. And then you can eat the second one also, because it's still a little risk. And then you can do it with the third and fourth. Then when you get to the fifth or so, it's actually, you probably already had the bad one. So you can just take the other ones as well. And they said, that's okay, yes. So, and that's the advice from the religious. And then there's, like, if you're supposed to be really kosher also, you're not allowed to drink wine, which Gentiles, non-Jews, have prepared. Which is a bit of a problem, because most wine is produced by Gentiles, right? But luckily, nowadays, it's automated, so it's machines doing it. Even though it's owned by Gentiles, it's not a problem, because it isn't their hands, so then it's okay.
Feet, maybe.
Huh?
Isn't that
Feet, yes, but there's probably, it's also automated, that part. So it's okay nowadays. Doesn't matter who owns it. It's just the actual physical thing, right? This temple in India, I'm trying to get to most of the religions here, not to criticize one. Tirumala Venkateswara temple here. It's a Hindu temple. You go there and you let the priest there cut off your hair as a religious ritual, and you're blessed for it. They then sell the hair, because Indian hair is the best hair to make wigs of. This can feel a bit like the church or the temple here is using these. That's one part of the story. Another one is, if you're an Orthodox Jewish woman, you're not supposed to show your hair to anybody else than your husband, because you're supposed to be modest and so on. And people solve this in different ways. You can have something over your head covering it so you don't see your hair, or you could just wear a wig. That has the benefit that it can be nicer than your hair, but you're still being modest, which is also a way of gaming it. Then the best thing, the combo, is that they discovered like 5 or 8 years ago that the Orthodox Jewish women were buying the wigs from the Hindu temple. So the two religions were working together a bit. And then it was a bit of a hassle, and then the rabbis figured out that it isn't that much of a problem, because it isn't icon clash and so on. So it isn't depicting anybody and so on, so I still think they're doing it, so it's okay. And then, yes, so different religions, just to show that people who say they're not religious can also kind of try to do this. How many of you are familiar with Pascal's wager? A couple of you, yeah. It's basically the French mathematician Pascal was kind of, he invented some things which has to do with games also, probability theory and so on. But he stopped doing those things when he became very religious. Except he had a bit of a relapse, because he thought about, okay, what happens if I believe in God or not believe in God? Well, you can't answer that without also asking the question, does God exist or not? So if you do what is very popular in informatics, the Flerfeldare, and you write, I believe in God, I don't believe in God, God exists, God doesn't exist, and you write down what happens, it's better to believe in God. It's a better bet. It's a better wager. It's safer. that assumes there's only one God to choose from, otherwise you get into trouble. Von Neumann, who wasn't very religious his whole life, when he was dying in cancer, because he was too near the nuclear bombs he built, and they went off, he actually asked for the last rites and so on in Catholicism, and kind of whispered to his friend that Pascal had a point. So he kind of was trying to game the system also. Yes, so interesting small anecdotes. Why is this interesting? Why does it apply to applied IT? Well, this is a slide we show to most of our students in the beginning when we're talking about designing things. And one definition of design is to initiate change in man-made things, which comes from Jones, which was one of the pioneers of what is called modern design in the 60s. And he was making the point that when we design things, we don't just design products, we actually design more complex things, not only artifacts, but processes, we talk quite a lot about, but buildings, institutions, markets, law, transport, these are all complex things which we design. And if you look at some of these features of them, well, you can talk about the states. They're in different states. If it's a government, it's kind of, okay, is one party ruling, who's ruling, how can you form parties, when do you have elections, and so on. That describes both the states and the rules, but you get feedback if you vote, you get to know who won, and so on. You have different goals. You can actually see these things in many of the complex systems. The users can have these things, the system itself has them. And here are a lot of definitions, which I won't go through, which are about what a game is, or what playing a game is, by different researchers and so on. And if you look at these, I've highlighted the red ones, they talk about goals, control systems, rules, systems, quantifiable outcome. It's kind of difficult to judge in many of these the difference between this and the complex system. So, where's the difference? You were saying like, okay, everything can be a game. Yes, it can be. So, people can perceive things as games if they want to, and I think the previous examples show that. And not maybe, well, one way, they can see it as games, and then you might say, they're cynical or they're not taking it serious. But it might also be that they're gaming it, which can be a very serious thing for them, and so on. So that's one part of it. The other part is, if you look at people growing up nowadays, they're kind of exposed to quite complex system with rules and feedback and so on, and also games very early. There are very few kids who grow up nowadays who don't spend a lot of time playing games. So people are very used to playing games and thinking in this gaming way. So I would argue, I don't have a lot of evidence, but I would argue that it's much easier for them also to actually see other things as games and game them. So we have this situation where we're having more and more complex systems, or organized or formalized, and we have a lot of people who are growing up who are very good at looking at games and trying to manipulate them or game them. So it seems like there's an interesting mix here. Yep.
You could argue a priori in the other way as well.
Yep.
If you stretch the notion of game and gaming as we did for several slides, you could argue that they now got less training in naturalistic gaming and only in a very narrow formalized version, so they will be less prone to or able to play real social games or real games.
Yes, but
I don't say that it is like that.
I can see that point, but I could also then argue that society is becoming more organized.
Like that kind of game, yes.
Yes, so it might be, even if you're saying that, yes, because we're maybe not we don't have the free play as much as we did. We're having more games earlier or something, but then society is also changing in that way. So yes. So basically, what I'm saying is, well, most systems can be interpreted as games if you want to. You can take, that's a perspective you can take on things actually. This is where I wanted people from cognitive science to argue against me, right? So therefore, most systems can be gamed also. They might not be designed as games, they're designed to be able to be gamed, but maybe people might be able to do it. And you could actually argue that this idea with gamification, well, they're already gamified in one way because you can play them. Not intentionally so, maybe, but they can be. And this might be a problem. If people are designing systems or games, or systems I should say, but not realizing that the people who use them can be thinking in this way and misusing it. Because you can't, I don't accept the answer that they're misbehaving, the users are wrong. If you set up a system and then somebody goes and uses it in a way you don't expect it to, you're going to say, well, you're not supposed to do that. It's like, your system has a problem. I would say, yes.
You wanted a counter argument?
Yep.
Okay. You've been using the word game in a very loose and metaphorical way.
Yes.
That's of course going to make it extremely easy for you to claim that most things are games.
Yes.
That's the counter argument.
Yes.
So if you would instead stay to a more precise and specific notion where you had something like artificial, essential artificial, you had one of the definitions. A game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. Now that's a fairly specific definition.
Yep.
And that has the word artificial in it, which to my mind is an essential part of what I would call, the old-fashioned type of game.
Yeah.
So it's not reality in some sense. It's just for it's fiction in some sense.
Yeah, it's... If we're playing this game, I would say, yeah, it depends on what you read into artificial. Yeah.
Well, but you're able to say at some point, did this really happen? No, it was just a game.
No.
But if you're not in the First World War, that example, that you cannot say that at any point.
What?
This was really happening. They were not shooting at each other.
Yeah.
This was, it had a much greater reality part.
And it's, an interesting example to discuss in this case is kind of the game of Russian roulette.
Yeah, there you're mixing the two.
Because then some people would say this is a game, and others would say it's not a game, because if you lose, you die.
Yeah.
So it isn't artificial.
So you're crossing the border somehow.
Yeah, according to that, if you have this reading of artificial.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because there are many people who say that, okay, one of the most important things with games and play is that it isn't for real. Some people talk about the magic circle or something. What you do in the game stays in the game. There are quite a lot of people who argue against it also, because you take gambling as one example. Or addiction, where you spend too much time for it. Or that you learn something. It's a positive outcome of it also. So here's where people disagree quite a lot on. There's a romantic vision of games, that what you do inside it doesn't bleed outside. That's a concept of some game researchers. But then others say, well, this is a false picture of what happens. Yeah.
Perhaps a related issue. You started your presentation with flow and feeling on flow, but then at the end here you gave a lot of examples which has nothing to do with flow.
No, that's...
So, is this...
Is it relevant? Why did I talk about flow? Well, it's maybe explaining a bit. I don't know how much you play games and so on, so I don't know. So it's more maybe on giving you a way of thinking about what games are. Because in many cases, people who don't play a lot of games, or don't think a lot about what they do when they play games, they think about, yes, people are happy. You play games because it's fun, and that's why you're happy most of the time when you're playing. That isn't really true. It's actually you're more like what flow describes.
Yeah.
But then again, flow isn't developed to describe games. It's to describe when people are happy doing anything. So
Yeah. So I think that these definitions are like almost the original von Neumann and Morgenstern definitions. So they're very general, mathematically flavored, and
No. Look at some of them there.
yeah, but I think I can follow. I can see that connection. The original definition of von Neumann and Morgenstern is completely clear and mathematical.
yeah.
And I think that, these remind me of that kind of definition. But then it seems that you also want to include more than that, of course. You want to include like the aspect of having fun, for example, like some kind of cultural consumption or something.
I would say both Simon and Zimmerman and you, they do reference to von Neumann also, so they're clearly aware of him. And it might be actually, Yu's definition is a synthesis of looking at a lot of them, so this is clearly influenced by many others.
Yeah, and the second one is also in that spirit. Decision makers or players, they're trying to achieve objectives or optimize something in a limiting context, the rules of the game.
But
sure.
he is actually not taking it from a mathematical perspective.
That's not a very good definition at all. That could apply to anything.
That one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean...
Yes, this is the problem
No,
with
but
gamers. When you write
about serious games.
No, but I'm trying to make sense out of this.
No,
and there is one very good.
sense.
There is one very good definition to start with.
His book was named
Why
that.
blur it?
Then they stole the
not a
name
good
for the concept.
Von Neumann and Morgenstern.
That one, number 2,
Yeah,
the game
but
is an
it just
activity.
connects. These
Maybe it connects, but it's not good, and it disconnects also, I hope.
What is the good one?
No, but there is a mathematical definition which is really good and extremely general. And then I'm just trying to understand what you want to include.
One thing which is interesting with von Neumann's definition, which it seems like in hindsight I should have included here, they actually have the players as part of the definition, what a game is, which the others don't, because the others see the game as something the players manipulate or is the activity that they're performing. So they do, there's this, I would say that's the big difference between the von Neumann definition and these definitions, because these don't include the players in the same way. They say the player exerts effort, but it's not the player's not part of the game, which von Neumann says.
Yeah, but if you talk about decision making, for example, someone is there to take the decisions.
If you and I go to a hardware store to buy a lawnmower, we would meet the criteria for number 2 there. You know, so we have to compromise on getting a lawnmower. No, that's not a game.
It is.
And this is the problem. All these definitions
It is in a von Neumann sense.
You may be so, but not in any ordinary language sense.
Yeah, and that's because we, in our culture, of course, have a certain understanding, this is a game and this isn't a game. But if you're looking at the activities or the rules and so on, this breaks down a bit, right?
But for Neumann thing, is that only to combine the model of a rational decision with players, and saying that the game you have when you have more than one player and they are playing the rationality game, making a decision,
I guess
or whatever.
the interesting thing is that there's a quote where somebody retells that von Neumann was explaining what his theory was about, and he says that chess is not a game.
He says that.
Von Neumann says that chess is not a game.
It is according to his own definition. But, yeah.
It's because, well, the thing is, you can calculate all possible things. There's one optimal way of playing chess. We just haven't found it yet. Therefore, it isn't interesting to him. He likes the ones which are more psychological, or the prisoner's dilemma or something, which depends on other players, what they're doing and so on. And there isn't one way of winning it. Just to complicate things a bit more, von Neumann doesn't think chess is a game, while buying a lawnmower might be a game. My way of seeing this is that it's different perspectives you can have on activities. So that's why I think games are not that interesting. I think gaming is more interesting than activity, because you can talk about, are we applying a gaming perspective on the activity? You can see buying a lawnmower as a game, if you're gaming it. You talk about people gaming the system, gaming the dating game, and so on. It's a way of interacting.
Does gaming mean that you have a strategy or you have tactics or things like that? Is that what it means?
I would put that as part of it, yes.
Because you have goals. But then you are on the road to this inflationary use of the word game.
Yes.
Well, then of course it's easy.
No, it's what I'm saying is not necessarily that it's good, but people might be doing it anyway. So if we can't talk about it this way, we're trying to fool ourselves, but it's not necessarily good.
Staffan?
Yes.
I need to go, but I have a question concerning the game. You touched upon it in terms of publications.
Yeah.
If I sort of would claim that we are increasingly playing sort of a publication game now, how would you as a gamer analyze what is happening?
I know when they decided to have in Sweden the official government, highest government level, decided on a way to rate publications. It took 1 week before somebody at 6 sent out, here's the way we should do this to get the highest ranking. A mathematical formula. It's no problem. And it's the same, like, yes, Karin and I, we shouldn't write together. Or rather, we shouldn't put both our names on a paper. We should write together, and then I put my name on the first paper, you put on your second one, and refer to the first one, because then we get references. Otherwise, we're working together, and we get no references. Except if it's good politically to work with somebody else. Then it's good. Otherwise, it's bad. So it depends, maybe if you're a PhD, it doesn't matter, you don't need the references, you need the publications. If you're a senior, you need the references more than the publications, maybe. So yes, you can very easily game that. And I think it's wrong. So I think there's a problem with the system that it's so easy to game. So I would say yes, everything can be, but when it can be done easily, it's a sign that something is problematic, not good. So even though I'm a game researcher, I'm arguing that we should be aware of when people can game things and think, is this good or bad?
But then we should design rules that we don't want people to follow. We should predict how they would game it, and then design it so they game it in the direction we would like to.
Yes, so we're aware of that people can do this. And that's my point of gamification, basically, that this is something we should have in the back of our head when we're designing anything. Which I actually think is kind of what the takeaway is. So I don't think I need to go through this. This is something, it's a stance towards activities. Basically in activities where you have rules and goals and so on. It's easier there. Then that games are artifacts specifically done to do this, that's one thing. But you can do it with other things also. So if you're trying to create or modify an activity, you might benefit from realizing that people will behave in this way. Regardless if you want it or not, really. But if you think about it, then you can try to steer it in the right direction or avoid the most problem. And if you don't think about it, then you're putting your head in the sand and hoping for the best. Which is the worst solution, I think. And that's everything I had to say. So, thank you.
Can we go back to your last slide again? Activities including rules and goals make it easy
Make
to...
this easy.
which is gaming, right? This refers
it makes it easy to game.
Yeah. So that's interesting because we have a lot of, let's say, naive policymakers who try to increase the number of rules and regulations for a lot of... I think the last 10 years we've had like double or more the number of rules in Sweden.
Yeah.
So on your analysis then, does that mean that this has now become a much better place for potential gamers?
Yes. So they might become the ruling elite. Do you want that? Well, I'll give one example here. There's in Sweden there's something called Sverok, which is a youth organization about conflict games and role playing. It's the literal translation, more or less. They are often asked to give their feedback on when the youth authority is changing their policies on how to give money to youth organizations. And from what I've heard of my friends who are part of that organization, they quite often say, well, there's a problem in this and this way, because we would do this and this to make the most money out of the system, and that isn't good. And the authorities say, yes, okay, we'll run because our friends like this will run it through anyway. So, yes, this is a problem in that way, I would say. I think the people making laws, formulating the laws, they are kind of aware of this. That's why we kind of, it's the intention of a law rather than the actual word of a law. It's part of our way of treating crimes in this country and so on. So I think there's some parts of the government which are pretty good at this, but other parts are pretty bad at it. So, yeah.
And also according to your analysis, then lawyers are a kind of glorified gamers, is that right?
Yes. It's like if you see many of those movies, it's about finding these small problems and so on. It's the way of thinking, yes. Yeah, so they're gamers in that way.
Yeah, I think it's very important with games from the perspective of visualizing hypothetical scenarios.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's similar to books and art and everything, like even maybe music. So you can actually make scenarios that are just very abstract. They can become concrete, and in that way, you can ask all the what-if questions, which are driving creativity and problem solving.
Yeah.
So I think that's something extremely important about gaming.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I guess one of the reasons why the military and policymakers have been doing games. They sometimes call them simulations instead, but it's very much that, yeah.
And then I also think that this aspect of fun or flow, I mean, taking that seriously and acknowledging that this is something that will enhance your learning experience and change it completely. That's very important too. Huh?
We do not know if flow enhances learning or not.
Yeah, but
it's possible.
No, but I said pleasure enhances learning, and then
but this is very different. It's not ordinary pleasure.
It doesn't necessarily.
It does.
Pain
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Pain is just as good, Claus.
Yes, but study. Yes, I just.
So you understand.
It's very basic psychology, and it says that you can learn both by using the stick and by the carrot. Yeah. Right. No, exactly. You're forgetting about the carrot.
You have had pleasure in a flow. You have a control for the flow variable in the pressure experiments, right?
Flow without pleasure or something.
No, but when you tested this in the studies you referred to, that's never been with or without flow. In any control.
I don't know. No, I don't know. But it's, in general, I think that. I don't need to mention the word flow. I can say that gaming is associated with pleasure for many people, and pleasure is associated with better learning. So it's a great potential.
Yeah, yeah. I would say another point you could make about flow here, which I didn't before, so it's good that you brought it up, is that okay, if people get this flow experience by gaming, that's another argument why they're likely to game something which isn't a game. So that all these systems exist are a kind of, it's a lure for people to begin the gaming in one sense also, because it's something you like. Maybe you don't learn and become better at doing it and so on. And if you do learn, what you really learn is manipulating the system, not necessarily the content in it and so on. So, yeah. Well, I think you should have a go also, right? Yeah.
Now, what about exams? Do you consider them as a game or like academic exam? Or
when I give my course in gameplay design, yes, I do realize that people can game it a bit. but then I designed it so, yes, they do have many different small parts. They don't have just one final thing. They have several small parts. So they can get feedback and learn a bit and so on. The problem is, with my course, is that they can get grades on 7 different things. It's very difficult to get the highest grade on everything because there's always something wrong. And that means that it's actually quite difficult to get the highest grade in my course because there are too many small parts in it. No student has complained about this. So I, in the evaluation of the course, said that they should all fail graded because they don't understand this, since I give a bit of this lecture to them. But then they say, grades are not that important, we want to learn.
Okay, now what about, for example, mathematical test or something like that? Are they games, even if people, maybe they don't like it?
Yes, you can game it. When I took math courses when I was a first and second year student, the rule was you had to memorize 3 proofs and then be able to make one of the typical calculations and then you would pass. You knew what the limit was, so you could play it. If you wanted a higher grade, then you had to figure this out.
Yeah, but I think it's very hard to call like a mathematical test or, for example, in a high school or in a university, a game. I mean, I don't think many people will refer to a test as a game.
No,
but it's not really a game. It's a test. I mean, but of course, if you take, I don't know, the Sudoku is like a kind of mathematic game, but that is a game. But not if you're doing in...
So what I would say to that is that, yes, in the hidden curriculum example I had, I understand that people are leaving. In the hidden curriculum example, there was one person specifically talking about it as games. That was because that person had studied game theory. So he had already had this lens that could apply to it, right? I would say that that's one thing, if people see it as games. I would claim that people can be gaming things without perceiving them as games, because it's a learned behavior, basically. And I would say in many cases, the educational system teaches us to do this. The educational system, the people running it aren't aware of it necessarily.
Yeah, just one more. I think that if you talk to some literature theorists, for example, they will say that everything is literature.
Yes.
And that will make you kind of, that message isn't really very interesting. So, I mean, and it's what Alexander also said, yeah, no, but it's also what Alexander said about, I mean, that's the subject collapsing a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, you come up with many very interesting situations and examples, and we can all understand that they have to do with gaming in a very broad sense. But I also think that it would help the arguments to try to narrow it down a little bit. I mean, what distinguishes? Give us some non-examples of gaming.
I would just to follow up on your thought there a bit. I do have a book called The Art of Reading by Isser, I think his name is, who talks about how reading is interactive. Because people talking about games talk about games being interactive, right? But then the people from literary say, yes, when you're reading a book, it's interactive on 3 different levels. There's one, the physical manipulation. Then there's the second one, understanding the symbols, processing them to get words and sentences. And then the third level, most interesting probably, is relating that to your previous experiences. All those are interactions, those people. Which makes sense if you're looking at the literature. It makes no sense when you're trying to understand a game, and you want to say a game is interactive. Because it's like, yes, the game is interactive, I can just look at it and it's interactive. But what I would say to your comment there is, you can look at those things and talk about if it can be game or not, or if it can be read or not. Those are different tools or lenses or perspectives you can have.
Yeah, that's...
And then you have to kind of, what am I trying to do? And you pick one, or maybe preferably pick several, and not every once in a while. So...
That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, so not everything is a game because games are the best and everything should be. But sometimes you can see things as games. Sometimes you can see it as something else.
I would like you to comment on a game in which it is allowed to break rules,
Yep.
and I found that made the game a lot. Well, it was a lot of fun to play it, and it's a game like diplomacy.
Uh-huh.
Have you played those games?
Prestationsångest? What's that in English? I feel that towards playing diplomacy. Yeah. But basically, I would say...
Inferiority complex.
Yeah, kind of, because yes, you have to... You have to talk to people and make them trust you, and then if you're playing well, you should play very fair, except once when you should kind of backstab somebody.
Then you're allowed to break the agreements you've made, and nobody knows exactly when that's going to happen, and it's...
There are some other games. Nash and some other of the game theorists made a game called So Long Soccer, or the first name they had for it was, and now you need to look me, Fuck Your Body, which is basically the same thing. It's just, you can find it on the internet, you just need poker markers to play basically. Which, these games have rules, and the basic principle is you have to come to agreement with other players when you're playing to have a chance to win, because you need to cooperate. But there can only be one winner, so at some point you need to backstab them, to betray them in some way. But then I wouldn't say it's breaking the rules, breaking those agreements, because those agreements are not part of it. There are other games. Illuminati New World Order is one example. Stop, I guess. There are a couple of other games which include in the games that it's okay to cheat as long as you're not detected doing it, and so on. And some games have, it's okay to cheat in this way, but not in that way. Which, and then you can talk about levels of it. Because people doing game research talk sometimes on, you can have the rules of the games which are kind of written down. Then there are some rules which are consequences of how the system behaves, also the dynamic of it. Then there are social levels. So for example, you probably give a handicap to somebody who hasn't played before, or let them take back a move or something like that. If you're looking at the kind of ethics of being a gamer, some people argue that, well, you should try to win, but not too much. That's an implicit rules in nearly all games. These how to be a good gamer are implicit rules which exist in all games, but they're never written down in the games. That's something we learn by playing games with others. So yes, I would say there's different levels of rules in that case. But the whole thing with the diplomacy and betraying and so on, that's the kind of games which von Neumann thought was interesting also. Okay, I could go on forever, as you noticed. I would say most of the books I showed in the slides here, and actually some that I just mentioned, I do have, so if you want to borrow those and so on, I can provide them to you.
Could you send us these slides?
Yeah.
If we don't spread them?
You can
Yes,
spread
you can
them
have the
also. You can
reference.
spread them. I'll send them to you, and I put them on SlideShare, and I send them
easily
to books
find the
because he
references.
wanted them as well.
A personal question: do you live your life with a gaming perspective on most things, or do you try desperately to avoid that perspective sometimes?
The funny thing is, the funny thing about this is because I think there's quite a lot of game researchers who think I'm only interested in these things, like the gaming part. And I do play a lot of games, yes. But actually I think I spend quite a lot of time doing the free play instead. Being a bit provocative, leka. I'm doing that more, actually, or I enjoy that more, but this is what I work with, and this is actually, I play games in my free time, but in my social interaction and so on, I think I'm more doing the other thing. So, no.
But okay, with the English word game, you could call that gaming also, right?
I would say playing, because
You would say playing.
I'm trying to change the English language, slowly but surely, by making a distinction between gaming and playing.
Okay.
And maybe, yes, maybe one day it will change. Actually, if you look back 20 years ago, not many people were saying gamer or gamers. It's become more popular now. I don't know if people are starting to make the same distinction I am, or if it's just that they don't want to be identified as hip-hop gangsters, which is the other use of playing, right? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing us to this perspective on life.
You're welcome.
Hope to see you here again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.